Every time I decide to make a purchase for my video production business, I actually go through this kind of checklist that I made for myself to make sure that purchase makes financial sense. And I talk to a lot of people about how they make a decision, for example, to buy a camera like this. And almost all the time, they decide based on the spec sheet, or they decide based on a YouTube video, a review they watched, and they thought, oh, that would be a perfect camera. I do it a little bit differently, and a lot of times I don't buy a camera when it comes out. For example, this camera's probably been out for a couple years and I just recently got it. So let me kind of break down my thought process, and I'll kind of list the things that I think about. And I never make a decision to buy an expensive camera based on one of these. And from what I've done in the last 10 years, just about every camera that I ever purchased has paid for itself 10 times over, except a couple of minor exceptions. And I learned some of these from my mentor way back in the day, especially when I bought the Canon C300 back in like 2012. It's one of those cameras that paid for itself more than any other purchase I've ever made as far as gear goes. And I only broke my own rule a couple of times. And here's one of the examples. I bought a Blackmagic 6K camera. And based on my workflow, this camera has made me no money. I've used it for some YouTube videos and things like that, but we've never actually taken out on a production just because it doesn't fit for my workflow. For your workflow, it might be a perfect fit. So the very first thing, and what I recommend everyone do if they invest in gear, is keep really good track of it to see if it's returning back the amount of money you spend on it, and then see how many times over it's returning back. So what I do is I always separate my labor cost from my gear cost. As a freelancer, it's obviously the standard. So what you want to do is you want to put on an invoice, let's say a producer hires you, you want to put labor, let's say a 10-hour day, let's say it's $1,000 or $500, you put that. But your gear, for example, this camera package might be $450 with the lens, right? So this will be the rental for that. So then when I look back in a year, I use QuickBooks so I could see, hey, this item that I tagged as this paid me back $20,000. Okay, so maybe this package cost me 18, so I already paid for itself in a year, right? So then it becomes profitable after that. So if it ends up working for me for 5 years, for an example, a lot of these FS7s, for example, I've had for 5 years, then I could see, wow, that's paid 5 times over or 10 times over what I spend on it. But I have to keep track in order to actually do the math to see if it makes sense. Now, if you're freelancing or if you have your video production company, the only difference is in my video production company, I never put that on an invoice that a client sees. It's more a bulk item like production services, which includes gear. When I was freelancing, a lot of times when I worked with a producer or another production company, they'll see the breakdown because that's what they expect to see. Now, having done that for a long time, I could tell you exactly what every piece of gear has returned, right? So the Blackmagic has paid nothing. These cameras, like this FS7, has paid for itself 10 times over. Some of my lenses have paid for themselves 20 times over. Monitors have paid for themselves 20 times over. So some things, lighting, some things that work for a long time could really be a good investment. So that's the number one way I actually analyze it. Now, the second decision I make is actually, I think about it a little bit differently, which is I don't look at it so much from the creative standpoint first, especially when I'm running a production company. Every piece of gear I buy needs to actually make sense financially, and it needs to basically return my investment by a multiple. Now, when I make creative decision, a lot of times I rent those cameras. So a lot of shoots where we go on, where we use a Red camera or Alexa camera, those cameras are specialty cameras, in my opinion, based on the type of work that I do, right? Yes, you can use an Alexa just about on every shoot, but it doesn't make financial sense because if you look at the return on investment on an $80,000, $100,000 camera package, it doesn't make sense for a lot of the jobs to charge $1,500 or $2,000 a day for that camera package. So I don't use it. This makes a lot more sense for the type of jobs I do. So I usually pick a camera. The second point is all about picking a camera that fits with your workflow that you could utilize as much as possible. If you think, for example, you have a camera where you need to shoot slow motion with it and you need to shoot really high frame rate, and maybe you need to even rent a Phantom, that's a camera that you rent, right? Red, Alexa, a lot of the higher end cameras are usually rental cameras, unless you go a DP path and you want to just be an owner operator on a high end level. So the Sony FX7, the Sony FX9, even the A7S III on a gimbal, the Canon C300 Mark I and II back in the day, those really were cameras that returned my money back because they fit my workflow. So every job where I thought, hey, is this camera a good package? I would put it on that job and then I would bill for it. And it would actually make sense for me to keep track of it long term and see how much it paid back for itself. Now, when I made a decision as a DP, a lot of times it was about the creativity behind the project, right? So then I would make the decision not as a production company per se. I would just say, hey, what's the best possible camera for this job? Do we own it? No? Okay, let's rent it. It doesn't make sense to buy it, right? Especially if I'm doing a 2-day job. Now, the third thing I always do is I never buy a camera right when it gets released. Again, I've done it before with this Blackmagic camera, for example. I was on a waiting list. But the reason why I don't do it now is because I want to see what camera starts dominating the industry. And I could usually tell within a year or two what camera is really taking off. I could tell, again, with the Sony FS7, it just became the standard in the type of work I do in commercial and corporate work. The FX9, it's been around a couple years, but I'm seeing that it's, again, dominating and it fits with my workflow. So I go through my list and I was like, okay, this definitely checks number 3 now, right? I'm seeing a lot of DPs use it out there. I'm not making the decision based on what YouTube videos, what reviews are being done on it. I'm actually looking around my town, my area to see what's actually dominating. And then I talk to other production companies and sometimes my clients that have internal production staff, or maybe they have a camera they own internally. Some companies have that. I want to see where they're actually going with this too. So this, for example, this FX9 is going to get me the most bang for my buck because I could use it on so many different jobs. Fourth is really important. I always got to do the math to figure out how long will it take, how many shoots technically that I could have to pay off a piece of gear. So just to give you an example, usually if you look at a rental house that rents cinema cameras or other video production equipment, if you look at a camera package, their pricing is based on that camera getting paid off after 20 to 40 rentals, right? That's the range that I've seen. So I would look at this camera, let's say with the lens, accessories, tax, everything all in, let's say it cost me roughly $20,000 with a couple of different lenses, cinema lenses. So then I look at it, I say, okay, so I need to basically get this on 20 to 40 jobs. Let's say I go with the number 30 jobs. Then I do the math, 20,000 divided by 30 jobs. That's how I would get my daily rental on it, right? So you could kind of work in that range too. Now, if I think that, hey, this year I could have those 30 jobs, or maybe in the next year and a half, I could have those 30 jobs where this camera is the perfect fit, right? It's not this camera, it's not a red rental, it's this camera, right? I've done enough jobs in the last 10 years to know kind of my ballpark amount of jobs that I will get with a specific piece of gear based on the type of job. And then I would pull the trigger. Another thing is, based on this point, a lot of times when I have a shoot coming up, let's say I have a big project that's 2 weeks long, right? If I rented that, it's typically gonna cost maybe 25% of the camera's budget if I end up renting something for 2 to 3 weeks. So then I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, I'm getting a 25% off basically. That's a 25% coupon on this camera package. And it makes my life easier because I don't have to deal with a rental house. So those are some ways where I make decisions based on the math behind the numbers on paying off a camera. And then number 5 is sort of related to that, but I've seen so many people make a decision just based on this one thing alone, which is they buy things usually in December so they could have a big tax write-off, right? The reason why I don't do that, I do keep it in mind and it's part of the math equation. But the reason why I don't do that is because it's a never-ending game, and usually you buy a piece of gear that you don't need, right? Some of the other things that I mentioned don't fit in this equation, and I've seen people do this to their 50s, 60s, and a couple of guys into their 70s. Every December, they basically pull in their profit, they buy new equipment so they don't have to pay tax, they could write that off, right? And then it's just a never-ending game because every year a new piece of gear comes out, right? And if it doesn't, I could buy a piece of light, I could buy a van, I could buy all kinds of things that don't make sense because they didn't fit all the things that I've gone through so far. But if I'm at the higher end of the tax bracket, right, and it's December, and let's say I have a job coming up where it's going to work, this camera is going to work for 2 weeks, right? I'm getting that 25% savings if I rented it instead. But then maybe I'm getting another 35, 45% depending on where you live on a tax deduction, right? Again, not financial advice, but you get the idea. The tax break, plus if this is getting used, plus if this fits in my workflow, right? I checked 3 different things on my list here. Like, okay, I'm going to pull the trigger. This camera makes perfect sense. But I never use tax savings as a reason to buy a piece of gear if I also can't check off something else on my list. Now, the next one is, from time to time, I do use camera specs to make a decision to upgrade, but it's very rare and it's not one of the factors that I use as a sole factor. For example, the FX9 is not that much of an upgrade to me in my workflow from the FS7, right? There is super nice things in there. It's full frame, variable ND, all kinds of different things that I'm going to use in my workflow. Or if I have another DP shooting with our camera through the production company, it makes perfect sense. The S-Cinetone gray color profile, and it matches the other cameras too if I shoot S-Log. But the reason why it didn't make sense just from that perspective is because it's not something my clients are really going to be able to tell. It's going to make our life easier, right? But from the standpoint of a corrected S-Log sent to them versus whatever comes out of this camera, most of my clients are not at all going to tell. So sometimes when I did make those decisions is when cameras went from 1080 for C300, for example, to a FS7, huge shift, right? Shooting cameras that shot a baked-in color to S-Log, huge shift there, right? I was looking at some things I shot on mini DV tape back in 2007, and then the stuff I shot on the 5D, it's unbelievable the change, right? So when there's shifts like that in the world of cinematography, of course it makes sense because everyone's going to be able to tell, right? But if I go from a 4K camera to a 6K camera, none of my clients are probably going to care. So I usually don't make those kinds of decisions as the sole reason of buying camera, but they do blend in with all my other choices. And one last thing, if you decide to upgrade your camera gear, don't hold on to your other camera gear if it's just going to sit there. Once you do upgrade, let's say a month goes by, and I feel like these cameras or one of these cameras are just not working and they've really got to the end of their life cycle in my workflow and in my production company, you should basically sell that camera. Now, I don't always follow this rule. That's why there's a couple old cameras in the background, right? I think there's a C300 sitting on that back shelf. But I have sold a lot of cameras, right? I've been at this for a long time. So I have sold a bunch of gear, but I still have way too much gear for our production company. So if I was to do this over again, I would always get rid of a camera when it actually had some value, right? The C300 now sells for like $800, a camera that I bought for $12,000, right? So I might as well just keep it as a prop piece in the background, right? But you get the idea. If you get rid of it when it has some value, so these FS7s still have some value, so I could get rid of it if I'm not using it. We do a lot of 3-camera shoots, and these all have timecode sync, and it actually makes good sense for our company to keep these. But do get the money out of it at the end of its life cycle so you can actually invest in more gear when it makes sense. I'll put all this in text in the description too, so you can kind of make this a checklist for yourself. And then every time you make a decision to buy gear, actually go through it and see if you could check off at least 2 of the items that I mentioned, and hopefully I could save you some money and get you a better return on investment.